favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, let's continue with our positional rankings for the first week of the fantasy playoffs with the tight end position. Now, this is a position that I always respect as one that is so volatile in nature, so talented from top to bottom, that you can really choose and analyze any player you want from a fantasy setting, but in the playoffs, perhaps is the most exciting position just because of its depth. So I feel like this ranking could have been much more diverse and much more deep in terms of who I could have picked, but I do feel like if you want dominance, if you want a player who can be a difference maker at the tight end position, someone who some others might not even think about, these are four guys who I feel like these next couple of weeks of the season really will stand out with their respective teams. And I'm not saying that they're immediate tight end ones in your fantasy roster for the playoffs, but I do feel like a couple of them could be flex options if you're not necessarily comfortable with any of them. But at the end of the day, I do feel like when all is said and done, these four could be very competent tight end ones on their day if you give them the chance. Without further ado, let's talk about them, whether or not you're really thinking about these guys for your fantasy playoff roster. Starting off with the guy who I really think is a little bit frustrated right now, but can get going at any time, and I feel in this easier slate of games on the stretch for him, he will. How about Trey McBride going against the Pats? Still had 14 fantasy points against Seattle this past weekend, but ultimately still not finding the end zone. A frustrating stretch of form for him in that regard, but he's still an excellent catcher of the football. It's just a matter of, tough matchups against tough opposing defenses. But the Pats, I feel like they're going to key in a little bit too much on Marvin Harrison Jr., be too focused on that matchup to really care about watching the big man in the middle, Trey McBride. And he's going to get a lot of easy receptions, opportunities for yards after the catch, and thus will have a much better game, potentially find the end zone in this one. Because I do feel like the frustration also stems from Kyler Murray's play as well, where a lot more pressure is being put upon him, and as a result, he hasn't necessarily looked as comfortable in these last couple of games as we thought he was to start the season. So it's going to be more about remaining efficient, taking what the defense gives you, and thus a lot more of Murray to McBride in this one than we've seen in recent weeks. So look for Trey McBride to try and develop into this game, and if the Patriots play him more soft than you would think, look for him to have a big game again, and look for him to potentially be next year a guy you want again and again and again, week after week, to rely upon. Now let's talk about another guy who a lot of people have liked through the years in fantasy football circles. Maybe not so much this year, as he has found a new home still in the NFC East, but in a offense that really, I don't necessarily know is too tailored for him, but still could use him in certain situations. And especially if they try to wrap up a postseason place down the stretch, they might want to utilize him more than ever because of his physicality and because of his experience. How about Zach Ertz? After the bye, the Washington Commanders have a pretty easy stretch of games, the last wildcard spot, and depending on how the NFC West pans out, they could wrap up the last wildcard spot should they consistently win games. They could go 3-1 and wrap it up comfortably. But when I look at the issues that we saw with this team over that kind of difficult stretch they had, when they played the Eagles and the Cowboys and had some bizarre losses there, I feel like they didn't necessarily rely too much on the physicality of their weapons. I feel like Jalen Daniels and his rapport with those downfield guys like Terry McLaurin, like a De'Ami Brown sometimes, like a Noah Brown sometimes, really has hindered what he could do underneath. Not to say that he's losing efficiency, because he's still an efficient passer of the football, but I feel like his best moments have come from taking the short routes. And I know he's more comfortable, creating out of structure, creating downfield most importantly, but Zach Ertz has been one of the most consistent short yardage tight ends in football in that regard. And I know they're trying to incorporate a lot more young tight ends. I know that they have Ben Sinnott, Luke McCaffrey in their ranks. Well, Luke McCaffrey's more of a wide receiver tight end hybrid. As John S. in the chat, are the Yankees in on Bregman? I'm sorry, my big man. I am not necessarily talking about baseball at the moment. Potentially in the future, we will get more into baseball in the show. And I can't really tell you if the Yankees can or should be in on Bregman. But I do appreciate the question. That being said, as a Rangers fan, I hope he leaves that division. He's been a torturer of that division for far too long. So I'll be glad if the Yankees pick him up, even if it bolsters their squad, the Evil Empire. Hopefully that helps, even though we are a fantasy quote-unquote football show for the time being. But thank you for your questions. Hope you enjoy the show, my man. But in terms of Zach Ertz, I think that down the stretch, we're going to start to see Jay Daniels rely on him a bit more, and as a result, be a competent enough fantasy football prospect to really have you consider starting him week in, week out, down the stretch in the playoffs. Then Mark Andrews is another guy who I feel like has been underutilized this season, and I feel like it's not necessarily his fault. It's more of the circumstances of this offense, right? The Ravens, as I see it, are very similar to the Eagles in that they're a very ball control heavy offense. They still rely a lot on Lamar Jackson's downfield abilities in the pass game, and we've seen it in the past couple of weeks with long throws to both Bateman and Flowers. But Mark Andrews, I still feel like, is the X factor here because he is a brilliant route runner. He not necessarily is the fastest of players, but once he gets an open space, you can't catch him. And he's the biggest red zone threat, in my opinion, out of any tight end. And I feel like down the stretch for the Ravens, trying to get back to what they do best coming off this bye, Mark Andrews is going to be a huge part of that. He can really settle down this offense and really, most importantly, maintain his rapport with Lamar Jackson in crucial moments. And that's something that I really want to see Baltimore do, not just in these last couple of games in the regular season, but also in the postseason as well. Maybe you're not going to focus as much from a fantasy perspective on the NFL postseason, but I really want people to understand what Mark Andrews' importance is in this roster, even when he's not having impacts on games. I feel like the Ravens as a team are lesser than a lot of these AFC contenders when Mark Andrews isn't either A, catching passes, or B, occupying space underneath to open up things downfield. He's a huge part of what Lamar Jackson is able to do downfield because of the spaces he occupies. And so if he doesn't necessarily do that down the stretch, then I do feel like the Ravens could be a surprise first-round exit in this very tough AFC field. They have another game against the Steelers, a defense known for sucking the life out of you and sucking the life out of Lamar Jackson especially. Only one win against them his entire career. So Mark Andrews really is going to be all hands on deck these next couple of weeks, so to speak. And especially in the postseason, when you're going to need a physical tight end underneath to alleviate the burden on your quarterback, when all these defenses are going to want to send pressure in the AFC field especially. So Mark Andrews is going to be someone who I feel can be effective in the regular season, but also pretty vital in terms of what you might think of his long-term future as a fantasy prospect in the postseason. And then the last player that I'm going to talk about in this tight end ranking is a guy who I kind of feel like goes too often under the radar, mainly because of his team, mainly because he's kind of lost his luster in this offense, not a top target anymore, but still a very timely, opportunistic player who on any given Sunday can potentially be a tight end one. And I feel like this offense has enough juice in it, has enough excitement in it, has enough plays in it to allow this guy to get going down the stretch. This is a tough matchup here for his team, especially considering the fact that their spoiler role kind of got spoiled this past week when they tried to upset the Steelers for the second straight week. But David Njoku, let's talk about him in the landscape of tight ends as well. because I feel like David Njoku is the perfect middle ground for the position, because you have all the superstars, young and old. But then, in this middle ground of tight ends, you really have very few separations between certain players. But David Njoku certainly feels like perfect mid-tier tight end, because you can feel he's primed to break into the upper echelon of tight ends in fantasy perspective, but because of the inconsistencies of his team and his roster, really hasn't gotten the chance to. And over these past couple of weeks, yes, he's played very well. 17.2 fantasy points against Pittsburgh. Very, very timely player when given the chance. Very, very solid all-around tight end. But the question is he consistent enough to warrant true consideration as your starting tight end or potentially a flex player? I think the answer is tentatively yes, but because of the volatility of this Browns offense now and for as long as Deshaun Watson remains on that roster, I think that David Njoku is going to be hard done by more often than not. But in this match with the Chiefs, I feel like if the Browns want to make this a contest, David Njoku is going to play a big role, because the Chiefs' front seven are going to want to wreak havoc. But I do feel like if Jameis is comfortable in the short to intermediate areas of the field, then I do feel like they can move the chains, retain the football enough, keep Patrick Mahomes off the field, and most importantly, get David Njoku going. And if David Njoku gets going, it wears down this physical Chiefs defense. And so that's why I feel David Njoku in this matchup could be special for you. I'm not necessarily saying he's a lock to start for you the entirety of the fantasy postseason. But if you have him in your roster, why not throw him out there? Because he is someone who has that ability to be the tight end one for you, to be very special in fantasy week in, week out. But it's all up to what this offense looks like, because we've seen what it can look like at its apex with Jameis. We've seen the nadirs. We've seen the pick sixes. We've seen the inconsistencies in his decision making. But if he can get it right enough so that David Njoku has the amount of targets he needs to put up good numbers, the chances are David Njoku can play like a star from a fantasy standpoint. Let me know what you think about my potentially final tight end rankings here for this week, first week of the fantasy playoffs. Because coming up next, we transition into the world of odds, continuing with our look-intos for certain awards this NFL season, with the Offensive Rookie of the Year race heating up. It's definitely an exciting one to follow. We'll be right back to talk about it right after this short break.